Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Ferris, and today I'm going to be talking about a book on church history called The First Seven Ecumenical Councils, Their History and Theology by Leo Donald Davis. Church history is a fascinating topic and one which I think in general Protestants are not enough aware of. When it comes to church councils, most folks have an idea of the importance of Nicaea, held in 325, from which we get the Nicene Creed, and perhaps the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which dealt with the two natures of Christ. But the others are often mysterious or unknown. This is unfortunate because it's not uncommon to hear the charge that Protestants only know church history back to the Reformation. That's often true, but the other side of that coin is that some say if we read church history, it will make you a Roman Catholic or Orthodox, and that is by no means the case. The author of this book is Leo Donald Davis, who was a Jesuit priest. Now, I've written a book that critiques Roman Catholic theology, so it may be surprising that I'm recommending this book. But in reading this history, one thing that emerges is that Davis is not a partisan for any ecclesiastical tradition. He reports what happened at each of the councils, but also includes details about the politics that often played out behind the scenes. The subtitle of this book is Their History and Theology, but it could also be Their History, Politics, and Theology, because the first seven ecumenical councils took place within the context of the Roman Empire, specifically the surviving eastern part of the Roman Empire. Davis begins with a chapter describing the Roman world, the imperial organization, the interplay between paganism and Christianity, and the arrival of Constantine, who played such an important role in the adoption of Christianity as the religion of the empire. Davis says this about Constantine. Today, most would admit that Constantine was sincere about his rather confused faith in the Christian God at the time of the victory at the Milvian Bridge, and gradually grew in the knowledge of his new faith, always believing that a common Orthodox faith was necessary for the preservation of a unified empire. That detail proves important through later centuries because orthodoxy, or holding to a common doctrine, became a source of political stability and a way to show oneself to be a faithful subject of the emperor. And Davis points out that Nicaea was in fact summoned by the emperor. He notes that it was only in the 7th and 8th centuries that the legend arose that Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome, called the council. Leading up to Nicaea, there were lots of different things floating around about the deity of Christ and Trinitarianism. And Davis does a great job in giving the background on this, who the principal players were. With each of the councils, Davis gives a record of the events of that council, how things proceeded, what matters were taken up, what were the outcomes of it. And at the end of each, he has a section assessing the importance of the council, what its legacy may be. He also gives a chronology of events surrounding the council, what else was happening in the ecclesiastical world and the imperial world of the day. All of these details are tremendously helpful in assisting the reader to put the council in its historical context. Davis doesn't really entertain the idea that one sometimes hears that Nicaea invented the Trinity or the deity of Christ. That sort of view springs from ignorance, really. And those familiar with the developments see that what Nicaea made official in its proclamation was not an invention of the council, but a recognition of what the scriptures taught concerning the deity of Christ. It's also important to realize that councils were always called as a response to some rising or prevailing heresy. Thus, Arianism was the occasion for Nicaea to be convened. Davis also does a good job in covering what one might call the anti-councils, or councils that were never recognized as valid. The so-called blasphemy of Sirmium, or the Third Council of Sirmium held in 357. This was a high point in promoting Arianism. Or the Robber Council of Ephesus in 449, accepted only by the Miaphysite churches of the East, or those that teach Christ only had a single nature. I mentioned this at the beginning, but one of the things Davis excels at is providing lots of information on the political situation that prevailed around these councils, and indeed helped to shape them. As the saying goes, all politics is local, and so understanding the machinations, the positioning that various bishops were engaged in is important background to understand why a particular council was called, why it went the way it did. Quite often the creeds that emerged from these councils were as much statements of denunciation as much as what the faithful should believe. Politics really comes to the fore in the Second Council, the Council of Constantinople in 381. The Emperor Constantine had died, and one of his sons, Constantius, killed his brother, Constans, so that he might reign as sole emperor. Constantius then came into conflict with Athanasius, that paragon of sound doctrine, and a man who was not given to compromise when it came to the truth. Arianism was again the issue. Davis's summary of the aftermath again provides pertinent details on the legacy of the council. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 was one of the more important councils in terms of its legacy because it dealt with important christological doctrine, namely whether Christ had two natures or just one. Nestorius has come down to us as the one who taught that Christ had two hypostases, whereas the Orthodox view is that the hypostatic union describes the union of Christ's humanity and divinity in a single hypostasis. This, along with designating Mary as Theotokos, Mother of God, was dealt with at Chalcedon. This latter bit was also a rejection of Nestorius, who preferred the term Christotokos, saying that it referred to Mary as the mother of Christ incarnate and not the source of his deity. Nestorius feared that the term Theotokos would lead to an inordinate veneration of Mary, and one has to say he was correct there. Another detail of Davis's book, and one that could hardly be absent from a worthy history of the Church, are the various personalities that emerge here and there of differing importance. Men such as Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Nestorius, Cyril of Alexandria. These theologians and thinkers were important, not in the development of the truth, but how we understand the truth. And I think this is one of the best reasons to study church history. It helps us discern what happened and why. And we also need to recognize that no council ever thought of itself as defining doctrine, but rather only elucidating and clarifying what was already true. Now, whether that is in fact the case, this is another matter. The later councils that deal with icons and alternately either condemn or condone them would fit into this category. Indeed, so eminent a historian as Yaroslav Pelikan noted that when they were not simply scoring debating points on behalf of the case for icons, the Orthodox were obliged to admit that for a practice that was supposed to be based on the tradition of the apostles and the church fathers, this one had very little written testimony, either in scripture or in ancient Christian writers, to support it. Here, too, Davis does a fine job of simply providing history in an unbiased way. One never detects his own views or biases entering into the history he is telling. Another fine feature of Davis's book is, at the end, he has an appendix that lists the dizzying array of theological terms that one encounters in studying this topic. These are words such as monothelitism, monophysitism, or other Greek terms that describe the person and essence of Christ. Davis includes a helpful summary of each of these terms. Also, each chapter has a bibliography at the end of it that includes books dealing with that particular council and its issues. I have read a few of those books recommended there by Davis. Don't underestimate the value of bibliographies as a source of great learning. It's not necessary to accept the decision of the 7 ecumenical councils as binding to see their importance in history. Most Protestants would accept that Nicaea spoke biblically about the Trinity and about the deity of Christ, but would reject the 7th ecumenical council that ratified the veneration of icons. However, Knowing the history is essential to being a good Berean when someone challenges your view on something. I strongly recommend Davis's book as a great piece of church history. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts or comments about this book, I encourage you to leave them in the comments.